screen, and you should see the Blackboard shell. Can everybody start to see that now?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, and we are recording. What I'll do is I'll post the recording perhaps tonight, maybe not until tomorrow morning on Blackboard. It takes a little bit of time to convert in GoToMeeting, and then I also have to load it into YouTube, which takes a while to convert as well. But I'll post that link on Blackboard so that way if you feel like you missed anything or want to rewatch a portion or anything like that, you can always rewatch it. Although I'm not sure. I guess on YouTube you can rewind and fast forward back to a particular segment. That's probably why it takes a while to convert. In some of the other software, you had to watch the whole session through all the way over again if you wanted to review it, which was kind of a pain. But I think on the YouTube ones, you can go back and forth and look through. So I appreciate your attendance tonight. As I mentioned in the emails, tonight's attendance was not mandatory, so it doesn't count either for or against your grade if you're present on the session tonight, so I don't take attendance. But the feedback that we've gotten in previous sessions has been pretty positive that this is helpful. We usually get a pretty broad range of student ability levels with SPSS and statistical analysis in these classes, all the way from individuals who have never even heard of SPSS before or done any type of data analysis up to people who have a very high level of proficiency. So what I like to do is I kind of aim for the middle in these sessions. And if you have any particular questions or concerns, we can always address them. Also, SPSS is one of those software programs that there's a lot more than one way to do certain things. So your book goes through step-by-step process to do different types of analysis. But if you have been using SPSS for years and you know of a different way and you can get to the same response um, using it the way that you're comfortable with, that's absolutely fine. Don't feel like you have to do it the way the book says. If you know how to do something, a shortcut, something more sophisticated, something easier for you, as long as we all come to the same answer. It's kind of like that saying there's more than one way up the mountain. And I am getting a little bit of feedback from someone, so just double check if you just joined us and make sure that you're muted, and so that way we don't hear some feedback and some echoing and keys clicking and whatnot in the background. If we do seem to have a problem with it, I'll go ahead and mute everybody, but then that's kind of a pain because if you want to speak, then I have to unmute you individually. All right, so just briefly, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I have a pretty good background in data analysis and quantitative research methodologies. I worked for my state legislature for about 7 or 8 years doing data analysis, and I'm also an academician by trade. So I kind of seen both sides of the coin, both the academic type research and the more applied type research. I don't know that I could give you my preference as to which one I like better. I really like them both. I liked the applied nature of the analysis projects that I did for the legislature because I got to see some immediate implications of what we were doing and how they would change policies or rules or procedures. So that was nice, but our work was heavily influenced by statute. So we really only got to take a look at what somebody else needed us to look at. So that was a disadvantage. Um, Another advantage was we had access to whatever data we needed pretty much right away because we were legislatively entitled to go into an agency and ask them for their data sources. So we didn't have this struggle to find public access data or data that we could get a handle on. We basically had, our pick of what we needed to answer our questions. Whereas in academic research, you have some really good ideas that you come up with, and then you have a hard time trying to find where you might be able to access data because sometimes people with the data sets aren't very forthcoming if something's not in it for them, if there's no incentive. But on the academic side, I really get to do the research that I want to do. I get to focus on what I want to focus on, clearly within some parameters, but I get to pursue my own independent research agenda and I'm not constrained by what the statute says needs to be done. So that's good. I really felt like my work at my state legislature allowed me to apply these skills that I learned in my PhD program. A lot of students come into a PhD program and really grapple with, well, what am I ever going to use these for, especially if I'm not going to be an academic researcher. But knowing how to be able to do these things is incredibly important, if for nothing else than the fact that you have to write a dissertation to get done. So learning how to do it is incredibly helpful. And fortunately, we have programs like SPSS to help us along the way. I really can't even imagine what it was like before they had these software packages that basically enable, you're pretty much anybody who has the time and the ability to learn how to use them to do these higher level analyses. I can't imagine what that was like beforehand, writing a dissertation or doing data analysis, what it was like before we had programs like SPSS. I'm a huge fan of SPSS. I think it's incredibly user friendly. If you know how to use Microsoft Office products and again have the time and the ability to get on and learn it, pretty much anybody can learn how to use it. It's very simple. And even in the last 10 or 15 years since I started using it, it's become even more simple to use with the different menu driven options and the point and click. When I first learned SPSS, my major professor at that time, the way he did it was he had to write code to use SPSS. So he had to learn everything in SPSS by writing code. And so he wanted me to do that. He wanted me to learn everything in SPSS by writing code. And, as an enthusiastic young doctoral student, I was intrigued but intimidated and didn't know how much extra effort that was going to be on my part and when I would have the time to be able to do it. So while I didn't have to learn everything that way, I did pick up quite a bit of learning how to write code and running code in SPSS, running syntax. And I think that's been incredibly helpful for me because I can do my analyses both ways. I can use the menu driven prompts and I can write code when I need to. So I really encourage you, if that's something you're interested in, learning how to write code and learning how to use the syntax component of SPSS, I really encourage you to do that, especially when you get to your dissertation, because one of the best parts about it is that it leaves an audit trail for you. If you need to rerun your analysis at any time, whether you have a committee member or your chair wants to see what you've done and wants you to rerun it, it's an audit trail, and it's repeatable, which is something that we want to do when we're doing the scientific method. We don't want to just be able to run something once and get the correct results and be like, oh my God, thank God, I got the answer to the question. Phew, I have no idea how I got there, but I got there. We want to be able to repeat what we've done with that level of rigor and scientific merit. So there are a couple extra steps to learning how to do that, but once you kind of get the hang of it's not real hard. It's not real difficult. Something I wanted to show you was underneath your supplemental materials tab on Blackboard over here. And I recently got a Mac. And so as I'm telling you to potentially learn a new computer program, I'm trying to learn one myself. And so it does things differently. So forgive me if I'm a little cumbersome in finding some of the information here. But if you go to supplemental materials tab in Blackboard and you go to the SPSS resources folder, you can click on that. And there's some good resources in here, but the one that I would suggest you go to if you're really brand new and want some things that'll be a good overview is this SPSS channel on YouTube. And I don't know who this person is. HNAP1000 uploads and posts these things, and it's all public domain, freeware. But they're really good YouTube tutorials, and they're very short and sweet and simple, and they're focused, which is nice too. So if you know that you need to do chi-square and you need a tutorial on how to do that in SPSS, you can go here to module 12, or if you need to do correlation regression, t-tests, ANOVAs, descriptives, how to set SPSS up, those are all really handy. So I suggest you check that out. These other pages are pretty good as well. So you can check those out, some tutorials. All right, any questions or concerns before we move on?
No.
Okay. Well, what I have planned for tonight is I want to go ahead and open up SPSS, and we're going to go through some examples. We have the examples that were listed on the sheet for you to prepare for tonight, so you might have been able to look at some of them right now. But they'll be similar to what you'll be required to do in the homework. Some of you may have, started the homework. Some of you may have already turned the homework in if you're that far ahead of the game. But the examples that we'll go through both tonight and next week should help you set you up for the homework. And I also want to mention, I'm not sure what version of SPSS the book was written off of. So some of the things that you read in the book may be a little teeny bit different than when you get into the newest version of SPSS that you've probably downloaded from your student pack. Some of the things might be a little bit different, and I know that can be frustrating for some students, especially if you're brand new to SPSS, because you're really trying to use the cookbook approach and go step by step through this book, and then you find that something might be different because the software has been updated since the book's been printed. If you find anything like that, that's really a problem. Just shoot me an email and let me know. But I found a couple of things, but for the most part, it doesn't give students too much of a problem in the assignments. Um, I think at some point we're going to have to either find out if they have an updated version of this book or just change text altogether. But that would be, of course, Dr. Mast and Dr. Rauch's call on that. Another thing I want to mention, if you try to send me an email, I highly recommend just sending it to my personal email account. I have a lot of issues with the Indiana Tech, so I don't use it and I don't rely on it. And I'm going to go ahead and retype my personal email here in the chat book block just in case you don't have it. So if you have any questions or concerns, you can send to my Indy Tech, but please send to that personal email as well so I can be sure to respond. All right. So depending on what type of computer you're running, in addition to the version of SPSS, the Windows might look a little bit different than the Mac, but it is very similar. Fortunately for me, it's not too much different in that regard, so there wasn't too much of a learning curve. But you've got several different ways to open up your SPSS. So you just want to go in and you're going to open up your program. And this one's running version 19. I'm not sure what you guys have downloaded, what the student version's up to now. I think I heard something like it's up to 21. They should all be backwards compatible, so you shouldn't have to worry about that. And actually, that reminds me of another really good point that I posted back in the beginning of the class, is that make sure, and it's kind of late in the game now, so hopefully nobody has this problem, but make sure that you have a new and not a used version of this Sweet and Martin data analysis text, because if you buy a used book, there is a high probability that you're going to have some pages ripped out. Now, whether or not those are actually pages you're going to need to do your assignments is a little bit less probable, but sometimes we've had students who go in to do their book looks fine. They go in to do their assignment and they realize they have 4 pages from their assignment torn out because as you can see in your textbook, if you look at it, it is workbook style. So in the brick and mortar schools where they turn things in, they might have actually turned them in, or I know we have students with this class who will rip the pages out and scan them. That way you can turn them in all in one file. So go through both your assignment for this week and your assignment for next week and just make sure that all the pages that you're required to have are there. If you've bought a new textbook, you shouldn't have to be worried about that, hypothetically, but just double check in case. Also, you should have a disc.
One quick.
Okay, question? Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say one quick question. If for when we submit things, though, it can be screenshots and stuff in a Word document's fine, right?
Yes, absolutely. However,
Okay.
you can best get this cumbersome assignment into one document is absolutely fine with me. Some people like to scan in PDF, some people like to screenshot, some people, however you want to do it, just as long as you get it all in. That's the key, is that it needs to be in one file. Because if you upload, 4, 5, 6 files into Blackboard, then I don't know. I have to kind of go on a scavenger hunt to find where the information is to grade. And usually I'm patient enough to do that for a little while, but most of the time I'm trying to move through these relatively quickly and turn them around relatively quickly to you guys so you can get your feedback, especially for this first assignment. So if you need to make any changes for the second one, you can with enough time. But yeah, as long as you can get it into one document, that's good. So the disc, yes, make sure you have a CD in the back of your text. You have to have that CD back there. If you don't have a CD, I've been able to email the files a couple of times to people, but it hasn't worked a couple of times, and there's no sure shot. So just make sure you have all the stuff that you need to take care of the assignments. So when you open your version of SPSS, there's a couple of different ways to get to things. And your screen may or may not look exactly like this, and the book may or may not look exactly like this. So just keep that in mind, although I know that can be, kind of stressful to people who are just learning things for the first time when it doesn't look the same, but it's just negligibly different for the most part, so it should be okay. The question is, for the homework assignments, are your assignments all due on Sundays for the class this session?
That's what it has been.
Okay, yes. Yeah, then it'll be the
5
same.
weeks.
So yeah, so Sunday at 11:59 will be when the assignment's due. And then the same thing with next week. I know Indiana Tech runs their sessions such that even if there's a holiday, it really doesn't change the due dates of things. I think that for some of the immersions, they've changed some due dates, but for everything else, it pretty much remains the same. So it's nice to kind of be on a schedule and to know that you've got to get your assignments done by Sunday. And if you do have questions or concerns, please try to email me before rather than later. If you email me on Saturday afternoon, I may or may not be able to check my email and get back to you and answer your question by the time that the homework is due. So take a look and send me any questions ahead of time if possible. So there's a few ways here to open up your SPSS, depending on what you need to do. You can do some built-in tutorials here if you have the time. If you're starting a brand new data set, you just click type in data. You can open a new data set or create a new data set. But for right now, you can come over here to the more files and open an existing data source, which is what you would probably want to do if you're going to grab one of these files and just open it up and start your assignment. But for right now, I just want to take a look at our screen here. So this may look similar to an Excel spreadsheet to many of you, and that's kind of how I like to think of the layout of this. So we have columns that go across the top, and we have rows that go down the side, just like you would in an Excel file. So the columns running across the top represent our variables in our study. So depending on what we're studying, we might have 2 variables or we might have 200 variables. It just depends on what our research question is and what we're looking at. But our variables would be things like our independent variables, our dependent variable or variables, our control variables, mediators, moderators, all of those things will be up here in these columns. And our rows represent our cases or our units of analysis. So this could be individual responses. If we have people that we're measuring characteristics of in our study, these would be the responses for the people. Perhaps we're studying counties or states or census tracts, whatever it is we're looking at, those would be our unit of analysis, and that would be represented in the rows over here on the side. So then pretty much the similarities to Excel kind of stop there. Although I think you can do some data analysis with Excel. It doesn't do quite as much as what SPSS will do. It can do some basic things, but I would really recommend using SPSS if you want to do anything a little bit more sophisticated than measures of central tendency. But down here on the bottom, you can see now that we're in our data view. So when this thing's filled up with cases, it will just look like a bunch of numbers or a bunch of words. And especially the more cases you get, if you only have 10 people in your study, it's pretty easy to eyeball things. But if you have 10,000 cases in your study, it's not so easy. So that's why we use these analysis tools instead of just eyeballing or trying to count from our data view. We also have this variable view tab on the bottom. If you click over to that, that's going to basically expand upon what's up here in your columns. Okay, so it's telling us what each of those columns are. All right, so we might type in things like weight is one variable, and height, and income. Maybe we're looking at the relationship of IQ and college GPA, okay? So these are all the things that we're measuring. And then these fields over here tell us about the level of measure that we're measuring. And this is important. We need to make sure when we're building a data set or when we're cleaning up a data set, as you've probably already learned in the class, I believe, you can only do certain types of statistical analyses with certain levels of measure of your variables. So we need to make sure that we tell SPSS everything we need to tell it about our variables. And we're going to go through some of these examples here in a little bit, but we need to tell it what to do. If it's a numeric, if it's a string, if it's dollar, it needs to know all of these things in advance. How many decimal places, what to do with missing values, the level of measure. Remember nominal, ordinal, interval ratio? It needs to know these things. And as sophisticated as SPSS is and as advanced as it is, it's still not quite as smart as the human brain. I like to use the example of if you take a calculator, just a regular old-fashioned handheld calculator out, and you punch a bunch of numbers, and you hit plus minus, times, divided by, and then a bunch of other numbers, and then you hit enter, it's going to give you an answer, right? It's going to display something on the screen. It might be a big, long error message, but it's going to give you a number because that little computer doesn't know if that's garbage that you're putting into it. The same thing with SPSS. It is extremely sophisticated software, but if you put garbage into it, it's going to spit you out numbers and it's going to be absolutely meaningless. And that's actually quite dangerous when it comes to research because we can find significance where there isn't significance, or we may have a study that does not reach significance where there in fact are significant findings, and it's not because SPSS or because our data weren't accurate, it's because we didn't tell it to do the right thing. So it'll spit out a bunch of numbers, but we have to make sure we're telling it to do the right thing, and that goes back to the conceptualization and the operationalization of our study from the very beginning. When I teach this research class myself, I like to focus heavily on that in the first couple weeks of the class, and your instructors this semester may have done that, but I think students get really intimidated when they're thinking about a research project because they're like, oh my gosh, I have to do all this fancy data analysis that I might not be familiar with. When in fact, the most difficult parts of a study are the operationalization, the conceptualization, the choosing your sampling method, all of those things are really where you want to spend the most time making sure everything is very well done. Because if you don't, by the time you get here to your data analysis, you might be able to load all this stuff into SPSS and run it, but your answers could be completely for naught if you haven't spent some time making sure that you've set everything up correctly. So as you can see here, I put these fake variables in, and then when I click back over to data view, it's now listed them across the top. So, if person 1 was 145 pounds and person 2 was 198 pounds, etc. And then I would fill in the height and the income and the IQ and the GPA, etc. So that's how we populate these data sets. Any questions? All right. Fortunately for this assignment, we have data sets that are given to us. So hopefully we can have a high level of confidence that the data sets that we're getting are clean and ready to go for us to do analysis on. This is another very tedious part of doing data analysis and doing research projects. Is probably the most tedious component of data analysis is making sure a data set is clean when you get it because when you get a data set from an agency or an entity, or maybe you've downloaded it somewhere from a very legitimate source on the internet. My background is in public health. I do a lot of public health research. So I use a lot of data sets that the CDC makes publicly available. So I can go to the CDC's website, or you can go to the census website and download data files. And you would like to think that they're relatively clean and free of errors and free of missing data. But you have to be 100% sure of that if you are going to use these to draw conclusions about your study. You have to make sure that the data sets are clean to begin with. So you have to spend lots of time doing that. Fortunately for us tonight, our data sets are nice and clean and pristine, and the text gives us to them, and we're able to download and use them. So what we'd want to do is we just want to open up our data set. So you can do that a bunch of different ways. You saw on the pop-up screen when we first opened SPSS, that was one way to do it. We can also go in here, and this is where it's going to take me a minute to find this folder. Here we go. All right, so you're just going to go through the menu and tell it what data set to open. And here's one of the ones we're going to be using tonight. So let's see what it does. All right, it's opening it. Okay, so here you go. You can see that it has pre-populated all of these variables on the top and all of the cases down the side. All right, and then if we look over in variable view, we can see that this is also all filled in. So hopefully these researchers have done a good job of ensuring that this data set is clean. Now, if this were a data set that I was getting from an agency, or that I was downloading from a website, I would want to go in and I would do a univariate analysis on every single one of these variables that are listed here. And I would look at measures of central tendency, dispersion, all of those things. I would look at how they're treating all of their missing values, how they're labeling all of their different values. I would look at every single variable individually before I did my first analysis on any of them, looking at any of them together, because that's another way you can make sure that they're all clean. If I'm interested in looking at the relationship between race and divorce here, just hypothetically, variable 8 and variable 14, perhaps I'm interested in looking at the association between those two variables. I want to go in and do my univariate analysis, or look at the characteristics of both of those variables before I tell SPSS to give me a correlation between the two of them. And the reason for that might be, maybe I look at the race variable and I see that 50% of it is missing. Or I see that in my divorce category, the distribution is very skewed to that maybe only 5% of my population responded to be divorced. So that's going to then influence what other type of analytics I choose to do with those two variables, because perhaps a regular old Pearson's correlation is not appropriate, because the characteristics of my variables they do not meet the assumptions to do that type of analysis. So we want to make sure each of our individual variables that we're interested in looking at are clean and ready to go before we do any type of analysis. And so that's what these first couple of assignments are going to have you doing tonight. Maybe in your study, you're not going to look at every single one of these variables. So you don't need to do that univariate analysis with every single one of them if you're not interested in it. It's only the ones that you're interested in. So maybe you get this data set with 40 variables and you're really only interested in looking at 10 of them. So those are the ones that you focus on and that you take care of. So with SPSS, you're going to have 3 screens or 3 viewers in SPSS. You're going to have your data viewer, which shows your data view and your variable view. And it'll tell you here in this top which one you're looking at, right? You're also going to have an output file that opens up. And this is important because it's where all your warnings are going to pop up, for one thing. So if you've done something incorrect, this is where SPSS is going to give you an error. So it's appropriate. But this is also going to be where when you get your results, this is where SPSS is going to show you your results. So when we start generating results here in a minute, this is where it's going to print them out. So if this is where you want a screenshot from to turn your homework in, that's fine. I only need the relevant output. So please only give me output that is specifically asked for in the questions. You don't have to give me pages and pages and pages and pages and pages and pages and pages of irrelevant output. Don't worry about that. More isn't necessarily better. Just make sure you include the relevant output that the question asks for. In addition to this, there's also one more viewer that will come up, and that's your syntax file. And this is the file that's really optional. This is where all the code is stored for what you're doing. So again, if you're interested or intrigued a little bit about how to use syntax to run this, we'll go over how to use your syntax file, but it is not required for these assignments. The only thing that you'll need for these assignments is really the information that's generated here in these outputs. Another thing to keep in mind too, when I first started using SPSS, it wouldn't let you have multiple data sets open at one time. So for example, you couldn't have this GSSO8 data set open at the same time that we have our little fake one open right here. And you can now, and that's very handy. That was a big complaint a lot of researchers had, was that you couldn't have multiple data sets open at the same time. You could only have one open. You have to go and close the other one out and then open up the new one. So it's handy to be able to toggle back and forth, because sometimes you might need to aggregate or do things where you're splitting portions of your data set out. So it's really handy to be able to do this. However, you have to be very sure when you're doing your analysis that you're doing it in the correct data set. Because when you get up here and you start pointing and clicking in these menus, you need to make sure that you're doing the analysis in the correct data set. So my recommendation to you is to just have the one you need open for right now at the same time. I would just go and close this one out. It's going to ask me if I want to save it. I'm going to tell it no. And so now I just have this one open. And so I won't have to get confused about which one the analyses are being run in. All right. So first on the docket for tonight for us to look at is Chapter 2, Question 2. And that starts on page 40 of your book if you're following along. And actually we need to have the other sample data set open. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to open that up. All right, and I'm going to go back in. We'll leave the GSSO8 one open just because we need it, but we're going to be real sure that we're running analysis in the correct one while we're doing it. And what question 2 asks us to do is it asks us to look at some of these variables and to really keep in mind here that these different variables are measuring concepts or constructs. So this is the quantification of something that we're trying to measure. And usually it's some type of abstraction that somebody's hopefully come up with a good way to measure. Somebody's operationalized a way to measure economic prosperity or happiness or educational attainment. It's not like some of the things that our natural scientist friends measure, where there's something extremely observable and quantifiable, like weight, for example. I can step on a scale and it gives me a pretty clear and concise reading, hopefully reliable and valid if my scale is reliable and valid, of what my weight is. However, there's really no machine that I can step on that will give me a measure of how happy I am or how economically prosperous I am. So people have to come up with tools to measure those concepts or constructs or abstractions. And there's a whole field of science called psychometrics and tool development of people who come up with ways to measure these abstractions. And it's really very neat. So it's also something you have to keep in mind when you're looking at a study, when you're doing a study, is you have to make sure that you're using a tool that's reliable and valid and that's measuring well. Because if it hasn't measured well, here you go, you have all your measurements put in your SPSS file, but they're not potentially not reliable and valid, and it makes the findings of your study irrelevant. So going back to the conceptualization and the operationalization, those are things you have to keep in mind. What tool am I going to use to measure the variables I'm interested in looking at for my study? So each one of these variables in here has been measured by a tool, some kind of tool. Either they've asked you what state do you live in, they've given you a depression screener that's told them how depressed they think you are. There's a way that they've collected all of these data. So what this question here is asking you to do is it's asking you to get familiar more with some of these variables and some of these labels on these variables. If we go back into variable view here, we can see that the variables, some of them look relatively intuitive. A state, I would guess, means the state that somebody lives in. State ID is a numeric conversion of the state that the people reported they lived in. But then the rest of these are kind of like gobbledygook. I don't know what DMS 395 means. And unless you get a code book with your data file, which some people are lucky enough to do, you're usually lucky enough to get a code book that'll tell you something about each of these variables and how they were measured and a little bit more about them, then you really don't know. But fortunately, this data set has come, again, it's a nice pristine data set for us. It's come with everything labeled for us already. So we can look here and we can eyeball the labels, and it's telling us what each of these acronyms means. So DMS 395 is actually a measure of the birth rate per 1,000 people in 2007. So we can look down and we can see that this is a very nice, clean data set. I'm going to tell you, in real life, they never come like this. They rarely come like this, but it tells us what each of these mean. And then we also know here that the first couple letters of each of these variables also mean something different. So that's kind of another clue. Sometimes if you're downloading data from a website like the CDC, or like I said, I've used a lot of Medicaid data in the past, you can also download a code book right along with it, and it'll give you more information. But what this is asking you to do is asking you to go in and review what these different labels mean. And then you want to assign the different types of variables based on which ones you think it might fit in with. So this is kind of subjective. There's not going to be 100% right, 100% wrong answer in something like this. But you would want to go in and you would want to find some variables that have to do with economic prosperity. And you would tell me the variable name, DMS 498, and then what the label is. You describe that label. So this is just a way you can become more familiar with what each of these variables are actually trying to measure. Any questions so far? All right. Let's move on then to chapter 2, question 4 on page 42, if you're following along in your book. So this one wants us to open our other data set, the GSS08 data set, which we already have open in our file, and it wants to take a look at one particular variable and its satisfaction with the financial situation. So we can come over here to our variable view and we can look and see. I think I have my mouse somewhere so I can stop using that way. Okay. There's a couple different ways you can look for your variable, but this is a relatively small, I know there's a lot of variables in here, but 125 isn't that big. I can eyeball my variables over here, and once you become more familiar with these data sets, it becomes easier to find things in them. They kind of almost become like a family member or a roommate. You kind of learn all the different nuances and where things are. But you can eyeball over here and see that this is what I think they're looking for, this satisfaction with their financial situation. We can see what this variable label is. So in case we couldn't guess, uh-oh, I just Mac did something crazy on me. Go back. Uh-oh. Somebody who's a Mac whiz might need to help me out here. All right, we'll just open up the ones we want. Okay. So here we are down here on variable 30, satisfaction with financial situation. Now, we need to know what level of measure we're looking at here, because we need to know, was somebody asked a yes or no question? Were they asked a question on a 0 to 100 scale? And how does SPSS capture that information? Well, if it's a numeric value and it's a numeric with decimals, why does it keep doing that? Oh my goodness. My apologies, guys. If it's numeric, say if we ask you what your income on your tax returns were last year, you clearly you report that in dollars and cents. But something like satisfaction with financial situation, the response options have to be a little bit different. They're likely going to be at an interval or an ordinal level. So we would code them in SPSS appropriately. And that's what this value label right here means. So if somebody has an answer of 0 on this question, satisfaction with financial situation, it doesn't mean that they were 0 completely unsatisfied. It just means that we've assigned value labels to it. So a 0 means inapplicable, a 1 means they're satisfied, a 2 means more or less, a 3 means not at all, an 8 means don't know, and a 9 means not applicable. So these are the full range of values that should be represented under this variable, under this question, 0, 1, 2, 3, 8, and 9. So that's why I was talking about you need to go in and do your univariate analyses first, because if you go in and run a frequency on this particular variable and you find a lot of 4s or 6s or 72s, then you're going to have to try to figure out what's going on there, because that's not a possible option. So either somebody messed up in the data entry, or, who knows what could have happened. But that's why you have to look at this first. And also you need to know that there's value labels for this particular variable, because you can't do certain analyses with this type of variable. We can't compute an average of this because it would be meaningless. We could tell SPSS to compute us an average, and it would, because it would take an average of these values right here, but it would really be meaningless because this is not a continuous range of values here. So if we got an average of 6.5 here, that would be completely meaningless because it doesn't tell us anything. Now we could get percentages, right? We could know 20% are satisfied, 15 are more or less satisfied, those types of things. But we need to know that before we tell SPSS to do that. So what we would do is we would go in order to do this univariate analysis, what we do is we would go in and go under Analyze, Descriptive Statistics, and then Frequencies. Okay? And we want to do some frequencies of this particular variable. And you can see in our text box here, these are all alphabetized for us, which is really nice, especially when we're first working with a data set, because it puts them all in alphabetical order and makes them really easy to find. When you start creating your own variables and making your own variables, you can switch this to displaying them in a different order, and that can be helpful, but it's nice to have it on alphabetized when you first start out because it makes it easier to find. So really with this here, we could tell this to give us some statistics, but like I said, it's going to be completely meaningless because we can have a mean of these answers, but it won't mean much. We could have a mode, which is the most frequently occurring, so that might be meaningful. That could be useful. We might want to look at that, but the text isn't really asking for that. But this is why we need to know what these things mean, and we need to make sure we're conceptualizing our analytics properly to know what it is that we need to know. But what we really want to look for here is this frequency table, okay? Because this is going to tell us how many times each of those answers are occurring in our data set. And this is the next step. We can go and we can click OK and be done with it, and it's going to pop our output up, and it's going to give us our answers. Or, and this is my recommendation of a kind of an extra step if you have the time and interest, you can click this paste button here. And what this paste button does is it takes and it opens up this new window and it pastes the code into this syntax. Okay, so this is the instructions that we're giving SPSS in the computer lingo here, right? So you can, if you're really into this, you can open up this syntax window and never use any of these menu functions up top. You can type in here and you can write whatever you want. And that's not going to get SPSS to do anything, but it's just an example. You can just type all day long and get it to run what you want without ever having run anything in a menu. But I do run my own code, write my own code sometimes because it's a lot faster. But what I always do is I always paste in my menu. I always paste in whatever I'm doing into the syntax editor. And then what you do is you just select the portion that you want and you click the run or this play button up here. And then it will give you that output or your answers. And here comes my Mac ignorance as I don't know how to get over to the output. Why does it shrink? There we go. Okay. All right. So this here would be what you would want to include in your homework. Here's your answers. All right. So this is telling us, it's giving us frequency, percentages, valid percents, and cumulative percents. It's telling us that looks like 28.3% of our sample was satisfied. 40 were more or less, 30 not at all, for a total of 99. Looks like we have some other response choices down here, so we need our code book or our value labels to know what those mean. In the book, it tells us that inapplicable is IAP, DK means don't know, and NA means no answer. So those are the things we'd want to look for, and it looks like a pretty small percentage overall of people didn't know or were not applicable. So that's good. That means most people answered this question. So we have a pretty high percentage of people who answered the question. So now if we ever need to go back and do this analysis again, instead of having to go through the menu, the drop-down menu, and click, 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 we just open up our syntax and we run that portion. When I worked for the legislature, it was required that we had to do this because before we submitted any of our work in to, help influence policy decisions, it had to be third-party reviewed. So we had a QA department. So we do all of our research and all of our analysis, and then our work would go to the QA department. And the QA department they would go in and they would have to retrace every single step you did, and they would have to come to the same results in order for it to pass the muster. So it was a really helpful learning experience for me in having to be able to do all this. And then when I had my dissertation and my chair said she wanted to see a particular section because she had some questions about it, I didn't have to go back through 500 steps of analysis to get where I needed to be. I just could open my syntax file and run it from there. But again, not necessary for your assignment, just an aside if you're interested and want to. All right, moving on to Chapter 2, Question 5. It says here that we're going to be using the GSS-08 dataset. So we're going to be working in this one here again. And it's looking at the Income 06 data. So she's gone in and she's looked at this Income 06 data. Let's see if we can eyeball it right here. Variable number 28. And she's gone in and done some analyzing. Again, different ways to get this information. I think the book might go through the variable viewer. I like frequency tables because it gives me some percentages and other information I might be interested in. Okay, I'm going to I'll just show you how to do this one by clicking OK if that's what you're interested in. I don't have to do the paste. I can just come over here and click OK. And then boom, it's going to give me my output. All right. So it's giving me all the information here.
I have a quick question.
Yes, go ahead.
In chapter 2, for example, like in some of the homework, like if we were question 3, if it doesn't specifically say to open a data set, does that mean it just wants us to make it up as if we were making up the data set?
Yes, there will be some instances where you will need to come up with a hypothetical data set, but it will tell you which data set it wants you to open if it has a particular one in mind.
Okay, so it's not referencing the most previous one. I know in question 2 it said to open the state's data set, but then our homework question number 3 it just says it's pretending that we got hired on as a consultant.
Right.
So we're not expected to use the previous data set or anything.
Nope. That one
Okay.
you would think of kind of your own hypothetical.
Okay, I was just making sure. Okay.
Yep, and I think you do have to do that for a couple of other questions too, so that's a good question.
Okay.
Okay, so I ran the frequencies here, and it's not telling me what the question is that it's actually asking for me to look at. And this might be one of the examples that is a little different. In this version, but we'll get to it one way or another. What this question is asking us to do is it's asking us to look at these variable labels. And if you look down here, you can see that this particular question is asking us total family income. Let me see, did I ask the right variable? Yep, income 06. And it's the way the output is giving me the output here. Still not giving me what I want. Okay, basically what the question is asking us to do is when we ran the frequencies for this question here, sometimes in the data, it will print you the label over here where it's saying under 1,000, 1,000 to 299, 3,000 to 3,099. So that's pretty self-evident. We can see that everybody could potentially have an income at one of those values. But if we come back over to our actual data set, we'll see that it's giving us a value label for each of those. Okay, so you can see here that there's also a label. Now, SPSS will give you the option to print your output with either the value label or the actual response choice itself. So sometimes it is more convenient if you tell SPSS to print your response choices because then you know that a 2 actually means 1,000 to 2,999. In this question 5 here, it's saying that she sees that there's a bunch of people with a response of 10. So a 10 is actually 125,000 to 149,999. But if you had your output being printed the other way, it wouldn't be giving you the actual amount. It would just be giving you a 10. So you would know that something is wrong there because hopefully nobody in the study is just reporting that their annual income was 10. While it could be theoretically be in the realm of possibility, it probably is not correct. All right, questions? All right. Let's move on then to chapter 3. And our first example question is number 1, which is on page 69, if you're following along. Okay. So for this example, it's, again, we're in the GSS-08 data set. So you want to look, and since we have 2 open, we want to make sure we're still in this correct one here. And it's asking us to make a prediction here, because sometimes that's what we do with our research is, we're hypothesis testing, or we're trying to make predictions about the potential relationship between 2 variables. So this here is asking us to make a prediction. And how many Americans view their marriages as very happy, somewhat happy, and not too happy? And then it's telling us to use this data set to actually run some frequency statistics so we can find out, maybe we can eyeball and see how close our predicted percents are to the actual percents. So as we did previously, we can go up to Analyze, Descriptive Statistics. We can go into Frequencies or Descriptives, and we can move this variable out and move our HAPMAR variable in. We need to make sure this block's checked here, because if we don't check that, we're not going to get our frequency table, so we're not going to get the display of the possible answers. Let's go ahead and paste this one in, and then open our syntax file. And we only want to highlight the portion that we just pasted in. If not, we can rerun the other stuff. Wouldn't be harmful, but we don't need to. And then we're going to take a look at what it says. All right. So right here we can see that 29.5 reported they're very happy, 17 pretty happy, 1.5 not too happy. We also have some people who didn't respond for whatever reason, so we'd want to eyeball that and make sure it's not a huge proportion of our sample. And in this one it is. We see here that 51.7% of our respondents said that that they didn't answer this particular question, or they did, but it wasn't in one of our categories. This is why we need to know what it is we're measuring and how what we're measuring is captured, because we can probably guess, if we thought about it just for a little bit, that perhaps that 51.7% of respondents were not married, right? So then they wouldn't be able to answer that particular question. So we'd say, oh, okay, it's not that there's a major error going on with this question and half of my sample wasn't able to answer it. It's that we would expect, perhaps we would expect that up to a certain number of people in our sample here would not be able to answer the question. So then it just asks you some questions about how close your predictions were to the results, and then perhaps what the findings suggest about the state of marriage in America. We might draw some conclusions based on that. But remember now, we're just really looking at univariate analysis. We're just looking at the characteristics of one variable here. We haven't yet moved to looking at the characteristics of 2 or more variables, or the relationship of those variables to one another, which we'll start to do in the next week. Okay, our next example here is Chapter 3, Question 2. All right, it's still here in the GSS-08 data set, so we're going to go back and open that one up, make sure that's the one we're in, running our analysis in. And this one is looking at marital infidelity. So we have another variable in here, somehow that's captured marital infidelity. So I would probably, before I started running analysis on this, way back at the beginning of my data cleaning, I would want to see how they're measuring marital infidelity and make sure that I have some level of confidence that it's being done in a reliable and a valid way. So they've titled this variable Everstray. All right, and it's going to have us make a graph. And there's several different ways to make graphs in SPSS. But first I would want to go in, before I do that, and I would run my frequencies just to see what the distribution of this variable looks like, because I'm just curious like that. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to examine this variable. Where did my syntax file go?
have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Should we, this is Kristen Halverson. Should we get in the habit of following and pasting into the syntax? Because I did a little bit of my homework, but the frequency part, this part, is foreign to me in terms of
I would absolutely
pasting into the syntax and but what is the expectation in terms for our homework and everything? Should we is this the best protocol to follow?
Well, my opinion and my professional opinion, it's a best practice protocol to follow to learn
Okay.
how to do this.
Uh-huh.
However,
Uh-huh.
it's not required for your homework. So
Okay.
I feel
Mhm.
like for people who might just be learning how to use SPSS and just getting the minimum requirement done, that's just enough for you
Mhm.
right now. That's absolutely
Okay.
fine too. You
Mhm.
don't have to do this pasting. You just go back over and
Mhm.
use your menu and hit OK, and it spits you out your output
Mhm.
and you're good to go. But now
Okay.
if I wanted to rerun one of these, and as you get more sophisticated, like this seems really simple. Like, why do I need to paste 3 lines of syntax? That took me 2 clicks to do. If I need to rerun it, I'll just reopen my data set and point and click 3 times and have the information I need again. It really isn't that big of a deal. But, after you've put a couple hours into running an analysis for for one measure of association between 2 variables, and it takes a while and you have to merge a data set or aggregate a data set or make new variables and those types of things. Having an audit trail is really
Mhm.
absolutely, in my opinion, necessary.
Uh-huh.
But for this, it's not. It's just something to play around with and to get used to
Mhm.
doing if you're interested in doing it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so we're going to look at Everstray and see what we've got going on here. So it looks like about a little bit more than a third of our sample didn't answer because maybe they weren't married. And then we've got a yes or no question here. So it just asked if they had ever had sex with somebody other than their spouse while they were married. So yes or no question, which is a nominal level of measure. So remember, we can't do a whole lot with that level of measure. It's not like a ratio or an interval level measure where we can run means and regression models if we want to, so it gets more sophisticated as we go on, but there still are things we can do with it. So what we want to do now is we want to do a graph, and it's asking us to construct a bar chart in particular. A bar chart is what we're going to use when we have nominal or ordinal level data, while a histogram is going to be interval or ratio level data. Keep that in mind. We're going to come up here and we can go to graphs, and you can go to this chart builder and build a chart through there, or you can go to these legacy dialogues. I'm more familiar with the legacy dialogues or writing it via code. It's really simple either way, but you're just going to go in and you're going to make a bar chart. So you're going to tell it what you want it to say and what variable you want it to do that for. So here's our variable. And you can go in and you can make your titles in here and do lots of other options. And then again, I'm going to paste this into my syntax. So that way, if I need to make this chart again and I've done a pretty fancy chart, I don't have to go through that menu and take a bunch of time in the menu. But if not, here we go. I mean, it's pretty easy peasy. Now, it's not really fancy, okay, but it gets us the information that we need. And now the chart builder actually is a little bit easier even. You can drag and drop and change your titles and all kinds of different things in here. And then so if you've gotten pretty sophisticated in building a chart, that's when I really would suggest you plop all that into your syntax so you have it saved. Should something go wrong and you need to make your chart again or change a little something, you can do it fairly easily. All right, and then the second part of the question asks us, thinking ahead, what types of forces might predict if an individual is unfaithful to his or her spouse? Can you find variables in the data set that offer indicators of this concern? So we might want to go back over and look at our data set and Of course, these are going to be purely speculation and purely opinional, and they'll be different from one person to another. But maybe we feel like year of birth makes a difference, or education or degree. Any of these variables up here could potentially be an independent variable that influences that ever stray variable. So we would just want to talk about a couple of those. It asks us indicator 1, indicator 2. And this is why a code book is very important, because we need to know what some of these mean. And again, we're just hypothesizing. Maybe divorce laws are really important if that's what that variable is. Maybe how stringent or how allowable the divorce laws in your area influence whether or not you've ever strayed. So there can be some interesting hypotheses that we may glean from this particular study. All right. I think that's it as far as our examples on the agenda. Does anyone have any specific questions or concerns that they'd like to address?
I think mine was just, this is Kristen again, on the frequencies. I must have just skipped that, or it's been 24 hours, but anyway, let's see, what was that? When you were on number 4 on chapter 2, when open the CSS or that data set, because I navigated around here for a couple hours, but I don't know why that section is foreign to me. But basically, I'll just go to analyze and my descriptive and frequencies or descriptives. You said about 5 minutes ago you could choose either. Is there a reason why, or?
It's just that you can get to the same place a lot of different ways in SPSS.
Okay, yes. Okay.
Yeah, you can even get, there's even some of these down here that you can click on and you can tell it to give you a frequency table, and it will. It's just the easiest way to get to it. It, I think, is up here under the frequencies table, or this option up here.
Okay.
All right. Well, if nobody has any other questions, I will let you all get on with your evenings and your week. And I hope everybody has a wonderful Thanksgiving if you celebrate Thanksgiving, and a safe holiday. And send me an email with any questions or concerns, and I will try to get the assignments graded and posted to you as quickly as possible. That way you can get a sense of how my grading is and what type of feedback you'll get moving into the next assignment for next week. And I believe we're having this session on Wednesday of next week. We'll go back and double check. I just didn't want to do it Wednesday of this week because it was the evening, Thanksgiving Eve. So I know that that's a very busy time for a lot of people. So if you're traveling, travel safely, and I'll look forward to grading assignments and seeing you again online next week.
Thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. Have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.